Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our University of Nebraska facility for those that are here in person. This is called the Eastern Nebraska Research Extension and Education Center. We keep adding a word or two to it. We're delighted to host today at the University of Nebraska. This is obviously another installment of a long-standing collaboration that the University of Nebraska, Iowa State University, and Lallemand have had focused on silage. I believe it was 2016, 2018, and 2020. Lauren, were the corn silage focused conferences for use of corn silage in beef cattle. And over the last year, in lots of discussions between Lallemand and Dan Loy at Iowa State and ourselves, thought, well, we've done a lot on corn silage, so maybe we should think about some other silage topics that are really of value, and hopefully today will be of value. That's really our goal. And so we made a little transition to more on the small grain silage focused, and really excited about today. As a result, for the University of Nebraska, Dr. Dranowski's been more in the lead and worked with the Lallemand sponsors and with Dan. Pretty excited though. Just to point out to everybody, there are some cameras up and there are a couple hundred people registered to be watching the live stream event today. That should be as seamless as possible, thanks to Brent and the folks at Iowa State. So excited to have this out worldwide. We also have some visitors from Brazil and Canada here in the room as well today. So welcome to everybody. Okay, so excited. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kip Kargis and with Lallemand, and he's going to be the one emceeing here this morning and taking care of you. But again, happy to see everybody. Hopefully today is of great value, and look forward to the speakers and the sessions.
Thank you, Galen. Good morning, everybody, as well as everybody who's out there virtually somewhere. We appreciate everybody coming to this event. This is the first time we've been able to hold this, and as Galen said, this is a conference that we want to focus on small grain silages. That's an area that's, I think, is rapidly growing. We put together a list of speakers here to try to address that. I would encourage everybody, as you go throughout the course of the day, whether it's in front of the group or you're off one-on-one with somebody, ask your questions. You've got a wealth of information in this room. For the virtual audience that's out there, we're going to entertain those questions too, and would encourage everybody to put forth those questions so we can get them answered. This is an opportunity for everybody to transfer information, if you will, transfer that knowledge. And that's what this day is all about. So with that thought in mind, I would also like to thank University of Nebraska, Iowa State. As Galen did, he kind of mentioned the committee that started working on this. It's been, I don't know, probably close to a year ago that we started putting this program together. So I appreciate their input and their insight on all this. At the same time, there's some folks in Lallemand that I'd like to recognize. Galen Losky, our territory business manager, he was involved in putting the program together, as well as Dr. Renato Schmidt. He's our go-to forage guy. Very instrumental in Lallemand's forage production system and silage management. And then last but not least, our silage brand inoculant brand manager, Lauren Kasten. She's kind of the quarterback of that whole committee, and it's not easy when you're trying to put together a program like this and you're trying, it's basically like herding cats sometimes, I think. So she ties up all that, got the committee together, kept us on track, kept things moving forward, and we ended up, I think, with an outstanding program for everybody today. So I appreciate all the effort there. So without further ado, we're going to get going on our program here this morning. Our first speaker is Dr. Daren Redfearn. He's a professor here at UNL. We were just visiting. Our paths kind of crossed in the way back. He's an Okie Stater. I'm an Okie Stater. I actually got my master's here, so don't start throwing eggs at me just yet. But speak to us about this small grains from a silage standpoint and the challenges. It's not a one size fits all. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Redfearn, and we can go from there.
So as Kip indicated, I'm going to speak a little bit today on the agronomic management of small grains for silage. And I'd like to first thank the committee for inviting me. Mary spent a bit of time coercing me to give this presentation. I wasn't sure if the reason was because I was the best, the cheapest, or one of the remaining forage agronomists that's still upright. But I'll take whatever I can take. So thanks, Mary. So when we talk about using small grains for silage, I broaden that out a little bit. You know, it's small grains have been used as a forage source for many years. More recently, one of the things that has happened is that they've taken the small grains and given them a new term as cover crops. So we're kind of managing two different concepts here, but at least in my mind, a lot of them are very similar. Some of the reasons that we are interested in small grains, and this is the background, is they should be pretty easy to establish. Has anyone found that true? Has anyone found it false? You know, no, they're very easy to establish. Once they're established, they can grow very rapidly. Usually that rapid growth does result in quite a bit of production in some instances. Usually lack of fertility or lack of moisture are about the only two factors that do cause some reduction in their capability to be productive. I'm not going to talk a little bit about the quality. Mary's going to talk more about the quality. But one of the other reasons that we have an interest in that, at least for ruminant livestock, are the small grains do have the potential for some high quality. In some instances, some extremely high quality. And then this last point, they can be economical. And to talk a little bit about that, I want you guys to think about this as we move through the presentation today. And I'll follow up with this a little bit again right on the tail end of the presentation. But when we talk about production costs for small grains, typically what we're looking at are the seed cost and the planting cost can be somewhere on the order of $40 to $50 per acre. The majority of that's going to be attributed to the cost of the seed. The recommended fertilization rates typically are around 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre. The fertilization or the fertilizer cost and the application cost right now can run around $60 to $70 per acre. So the total cost of producing small grains for forage, whether you're utilizing them for grazing or hay or silage, and I bring all three of those up because the cost of production, I think, is going to be quite different depending on how you use that forage. But likely what we're talking about on a per acre basis is somewhere on the order for as low as $85 per acre up to around $150 per acre. So how many of you said, now wait a minute, that last point on that last slide was this can be economical? Does $85 to $150 per acre seem economical? Not when you first look at it, does it? So so think about these as some of the points that I'm talking about today, and how we can make these more economical. And so my general outline, I'm going to talk about a little bit. We'll touch quite a bit on the characteristics of the small grains. Even though a lot of the small grains are lumped together in the same group, there are some differences that I think would dictate specific uses for different small grains, depending on how you want to utilize them toward the end of their production. Planting date, which I think is probably one of the more important agronomic practices that we need to be aware of. Some overall general management strategies, and then as I indicated, we'll talk about these estimated production costs again toward the end of the presentation. And then if I don't ramble too much during this talk, I'll have some time to answer some questions. If I do ramble, I will hang around here for most of the day so you can catch up with me at some point. So the forage characteristics of small grains, and I'll start off with the oats. Oats is one that's probably one of the more widely used small grains. There are spring oats and winter oats. I will tell you that the winter oats often will winter kill like the similar to the spring oats that are fall planted. So for the oats, I like the oats planted both in the fall for fall and winter use, and then also again in the spring for spring use. One of the more important characteristics of the oats is typically we hear about grain types and forage types. Those really are not fair designations, I don't think, because both the grain types and the forage types can be used for forage. Typically, what's those designations of a grain type? They're usually earlier maturing varieties. They're usually shorter in stature. So they're going to mature rapidly, but their forage production is going to be quite less than the forage types. Cereal rye is another one that's widely used. It's basically a winter-only type. The unique thing about the cereal rye are they are designated southern types and northern types. Both of these will survive winters. They both have a high degree of winter hardiness. What's unique about the southern types will typically grow a little bit later into the fall, but they also will green up earlier in the spring. The winter types, or northern types, as their name might indicate, they have a higher degree of winter hardiness, so they slow down growth in the fall before the southern types, and then they won't initiate growth in the spring until after the southern types. So they have a very long dormant period during the winter. One of the good things about them, though, is they still are one of the earliest maturing of the small grains, so they will be the first ones to initiate growth in the spring. Triticale has both winter and spring types. Triticale, as many of you know, is a hybrid between cereal rye and wheat. So it has both of those as parents, so it does exhibit characteristics of both of them. And some of the triticales, we see some of them that resemble more cereal rye characteristics than they do wheat, and some of the others will resemble wheat more than they do the cereal rye. I think a lot of the ones that I've been working with seem to have some of the more characteristics of the rye. Oftentimes, they're extremely difficult to tell the rye and the triticale apart until they begin to mature. The triticale is slightly later in maturing than the rye, and the seed head does look vastly different. The seed head of the triticale looks more like wheat than it does the cereal rye, but it's a whole lot more robust seed head. Barley is one that we hear a lot about, but it doesn't seem to me like it gets as much use. Barley, there are both winter and spring types of barley. Even the winter types can winter kill under severe winter conditions. One of the unique things about barley is it does have probably a higher capacity for tillering than any of the other small grains. And we've seen some of that. And often if you look at the recommended seeding rates, barley will have a little bit lower seeding rate than some of the other small grains. And that is due to the ability of the barley to produce a lot of tillers. And I will touch on wheat just a little bit. And wheat is, that's the traditional standard for small grains. There are winter types and spring types of wheat. Wheat is used a lot. Kip, you probably did work on wheat pasture when you were down in Oklahoma. Oklahoma is kind of the center of the universe for grazing wheat pasture. So there's a lot of information on wheat production for forage out of Oklahoma. It is the latest maturing of the small grain. And that's important because I think as we try to think about incorporating some of these into cropping systems, I think those maturity characteristics are going to be the factor that really dictates which one of the small grains that we focus on. Now, I've talked a little bit about winter species and spring species, and this is more of a kind of an FYI, but I do think it leads into some of the discussion that we're going to have going to have following up. So the winter species is they've got some cold tolerance. They have quite a bit of winter hardiness. Okay. And so for that to occur, they have a requirement for vernalization. Vernalization is basically a period of cold temperatures with short days. What that does on these fall planted small grains is it's a physiological process that basically induces the stem elongation and heading to occur in those winter types in the spring. Okay. So when we see the winter types planted in the spring, guess what they do? They don't elongate the stems and they don't produce a seed head. Okay. So their production is going to be quite a bit lower. Also about the winter species, if we look at the winter species and spring species planted in the fall, the winter species are going to have reduced fall growth and production compared to the spring species. However, the winter species usually have pretty exceptional spring growth. But as I indicated earlier, if we plant them in the spring, they do have reduced spring growth. Late fall planting reduces the vernalization effect and the spring forage yield potential. Okay, so late planting or spring planting, typically what we'll see is a reduction in the spring forage production from these winter types. Spring species, these are also referred to as winter sensitive and non-winter hardy. They don't have a vernalization requirement. They also don't have any winter hardiness. So if you plant them in the fall, don't expect to see any growth on them the following spring or minimal growth. However, they do have excellent fall growth when planted in the late summer, and they have excellent spring growth when planted in the spring. So here's a question I'll ask. And so as we look at this, here's a set of photographs. That photograph on the left was planted on September 22nd. The photograph on the right was a planting date of November the 1st. So there's about a 40-day difference in planting date. Both of these photographs were taken the following spring on April 27th. So what we've got is about 40 days difference in planting date. You've got about 6 inches difference in the height of the tallest plants. How many tallest plants are in that photograph on the right? Yeah, there's just one. Most of them are a whole lot shorter than that 6 inches. And then we've got extreme differences in stand and plant vigor, and ultimately we've got huge differences in yield. So my question is that late planting date, is that due to vernalization, or is that due only to the planting date? Have one planting date. How many agree with planting date? How many think there's some vernalization effects going on? A couple of you with the vernalization. Now, this is like anything when we're dealing with plants. We have these individual factors that we talk about, but ultimately what's going on, it's usually a combination of the two. I think planting date is a big factor in this, but I do also think there's some vernalization just because we really haven't seen the elongation of those stems from that single plant over there on the right side. Now, I will point out that you can't read the numbers on the ruler very well, but that's a 12-inch ruler. Okay, anybody got to guess what the forage yield might be in that photograph on the left of that good stand of rye? Inches of height, what's the yield going to be? Is it going to be more than a ton? Be more than a ton. Is it going to be 2 tons? Maybe some twos. So somewhere between 1 and 2 tons, maybe 2 tons. How much more growth does that cereal rye have to go after April 27th? if we're not going to plant corn. They were planting corn or soybean in this, so this one wasn't going to last very long. So how many growing days are we missing on this before it matures so much that it gets too low a quality to be of much use? A month? 3 weeks? I think probably 3 to 4 weeks of growth will catch how much potential that we're missing if this is terminated now to plant a row crop. Okay? Remember, 3 to 4 weeks. So how much does planting date really matter? I'll give you guys the take-home message here on planting date as we move through some of the little bit of data that we have. When we talk about planting date for fall forage production, I'm going to show you a little bit of data on wheat forage yield. That basically says that for each day of fall planting that's delayed past late August, in wheat, we're going to lose about 85 pounds of forage per day. On cereal rye, we lose a little bit less. On cereal rice, the data we've got suggests that we lose about 40 pounds per day for each day that fall planting is delayed. Okay? Is that a big deal? It is if you're fall grazing, isn't it? Now, what we'll see when we look at this is that in a lot of the data we're doing, a lot of the research that I'm going to show, we're trying to incorporate these small grains into cropping systems. So the planting date is what I would call not ideal, but we get it done, and so we have to take the effects of the planting date. Most important thing we need to look at is that spring fall production. So that cereal rye, and I've got it listed first here. What we see in cereal rye are carryover effects from late fall planting into spring production. We see that small decrease in fall forage yield of cereal rye, but more importantly, what we're looking at is that 140 pound of forage per day reduction in the spring from that delayed planting. Okay, so y'all make your calculations there on 140 pounds for 3 weeks, and let me know what that is here later in the talk. What I found interesting on at least the data I was looking at was that wheat forage yield was largely unchanged. Spring production wasn't impacted much by those delayed planting dates. I've thought about that a little bit. I don't know that I have a good answer, but anyway, we can discuss that later. So when we look at spring forage yield, and what I'm talking about is forage yield in April, when we compare cereal rye to triticale and wheat, usually what we see is that cereal rye will have a higher yield than triticale and wheat, but triticale and wheat will be pretty similar, okay, in April. Now, what happens after April? We see a lot of switching going on there. Okay, and this is the wheat forage yield. This is at 4 planting dates in Sidney, Nebraska, which is out almost to Colorado. So it's an extremely dry land situation out there. This is some pretty old data. I haven't found anything more recently, but if you look at the blue bars that are fall forage production, the orange ones are full season forage, or the combination of fall and spring. The planting dates on there, they've got a very early planting date, which out in Sydney is last week of August. The 2 recommended dates in the middle, the early recommended dates, the end of the first week in September. The late recommended dates, the end of the 3rd week of September, then that very late tickles the early part of October. Okay? And so when you look at those orange bars, largely what we see there is that spring forage yield is not as affected by the later planting dates. When you look at the fall forage production, you can see a decline from that earliest planting date to the latest planting date. Now, what we often see with wheat, we've got about just a tad over a ton of production there. During the fall of both years, even though we see some huge differences in the full season forage production, tells me that 1994 might have been a little bit on the drier side. So if we look at that fall forage production, what we see by day of the year. And again, we're talking about only 30-day window here for planting. For each day that planting is delayed, fall forage production for wheat, at least in this instance, is reduced by 85 pounds of forage per acre per day. Okay, so we do see some decreases in forage production in the fall on wheat, but not necessarily during the spring. Another study that we looked at, we used some corn hybrid maturities to help us with a planting date study in cereal rye. Okay, and so this the group of bars that are on the left, that was a study that was conducted out at Clay Center under irrigated conditions. Clay Center is a little bit west of here. For those of you that don't know the Nebraska geography, the bottom one on the right was conducted at Havelock, which is effectively northeastern part of Lincoln. So it's one that's pretty close by, and it was rain fed. And so what this study encompassed was a group of corn hybrids with relative maturity that ranged from 80 days up to 115 days. So we have a very short hybrid maturity, and then we have some that are on the longer end. One of the things that was kind of interesting observations to us in this is that we really didn't see any increases in these later maturities that we expected, okay? The reason that we often like these later maturity corn hybrids is they have a higher production potential. We didn't see that in the years of this study. Actually, we didn't see a lot of difference. It's kind of a sweet spot in here between the 95-day up to the 111-day, okay? Now, how many days difference would you expect between harvest of those two? I'll show you that in just a minute. Think about that. We saw similar patterns down here over in the rain-fed side. Yields were quite a bit greater, but we did see similar type of patterns. Again, here was this sweet spot where you didn't really buy anything much after 95 days, going to anything with a longer relative maturity. Yeah, these were all planted on the same date. The two different colored bars, that blue bar is what I call an early planting, or basically a planting on time. That late planting was a 3-week later planting. And so that's where we saw more of the differences on these later maturity hybrids was on that delayed planting date. So we did see some yield reductions with later planting date on these extended maturity hybrids. So this is not the importance of planting date for the small grains, but it demonstrates the importance of planting date for just about any kind of crop that we are trying to produce. The important thing that I wanted to get to on this was look at the planting date effect on a cereal rye forage yield at Clay Center, okay? And again, I've got pictures here. Had a planting date of October 2nd, which was the earliest planting date. The latest planting date was October 21st. When you look at the plots in December, you can pick the differences between the early date and the late date. That carries over into April with the early date and the late planting date. Okay? So that planting date effect in cereal rye is pretty significant. When you look at the maturities, even though we had quite a number of maturities, the harvest dates on those were quite compressed over about 3 weeks. But we did use those harvest dates to dictate when we planted that cereal rye. Okay? Now, even with the October planting date, we were, on a good day, we were right at about 1,000 pounds of production per acre. But as we moved to that December 21st date for fall forage production, it doesn't show there's any there, but I think they got out with a pair of tweezers and scissors and clipped about 300 pounds an acre. Okay, so there's a teeny tiny bar. I won't say it's zero, but it was pretty darn close. Okay. And so when we look at the carryover effects of this into the spring, we see upwards of about 3 tons of production an acre for that early planting date, down to about a ton and a half on that late planting date. Okay. Remember that 100, what was that number I gave? 140 pounds of forage production for each day that was delayed planting. This is where that came from. Okay. So planting date can be extremely important in cereal rye. This is some data, again, just to show you a little bit about, this was a cereal rye, triticale and wheat that was planted following soybean. This was some yield from a grazing trial, okay? That was back in the mid-2000s. And again, this was April forage yield, okay? But what we see the cereal rye yielding about twice that of triticale and wheat in 1 year. Another year, which was a much better year, we saw about 1,000-pound increase in each of the three. Over the 2 years, what we saw was that cereal rye had the greatest yield, followed by triticale and wheat, which were pretty similar. Okay, remember the question I asked, how many days of growth do we have left after the middle part of April for cereal rye? 2 to 3 to 4 weeks. What about triticale? Probably about a week or two longer than that, probably about 4 or so. What about wheat? Yeah, we're missing a good solid month and a half or so on that wheat. So even though we're comparing them in April, cereal rye wins April. Okay. Triticale probably wins the early part of May, and wheat probably wins the later part of May. So depending on when you're using those, this gets back to that point I made earlier about the maturity ranking on these small grains. Is when you're going to use them is going to dictate a couple of things. One of them is going to be how much forage that you have the potential to lose if you choose the wrong species and harvest it too early. Okay. So this is the thing that we fight here. Okay. When we're trying to include these small grains or cover crops in general in these cropping systems. On the right, Mary put this together back early. Man, we'd just gotten here. We hadn't been here very long when it was pretty apparent this was the thing we were going to be fighting and what we were trying to do with a lot of our research. But when you look at the summer and fall growing degree day accumulation, starting here about the end of July, with winter wheat, you've got quite a number of growing degree days that you can accumulate. So winter wheat in Nebraska is harvested first. Our seed corn's harvested a little bit after that. Corn silage is down here a little bit before soybean, and sorghum and corn and soybean are all lumped there together. So as we move through that fall growing season, it pretty obviously we're losing growing degree days, and if we're losing growing degree days, we're losing the opportunity to produce fall forage production. That was our interest. Okay. And so when we look at this, it says, well, that winter wheat's kind of a no-brainer there of something where we can grow some annual forages. Might be a little too early to focus on small grains at that point. Seed corn is another one. Let me back up a little bit. So winter wheat, very easy to establish, have a very high probability of success for producing forage after that winter wheat crop. Moving to hybrid seed corn, it's also pretty easy and has a high probability of success. Problem with that is there's not a great lot of acres of hybrid seed corn. Okay, and most of them are not using small grains. They're using a brassica and how will I say this, a little bit of oat to say they have some in there. When we look at the corn silage and sorghum silage to some extent, that's also very easy to get established. There is a high probability of success, but what I don't have on this is that high probability of success is in the spring. On the winter wheat and the hybrid seed corn, that high probability of success can occur in the fall. Okay, so there's some seasonality differences there. Soybean is another one that's very easy to get small grains established because there's not a lot of residue out there typically to have to manage around. Probability of production success can be moderate. Most often we see a high probability of success when we try to incorporate, especially small grains, following either corn or sorghum grain production. That's pretty difficult just because of the residue. However, we can have a low to moderate success rate the following spring if we don't want to terminate it too early. Okay, we can typically get enough grown where we in the soybean and corn to serve as a cover crop, but it's typically not enough. We could probably have a small amount of grazing on it, but there's really not going to be enough there to mechanically harvest. Okay, that's why that planting date back in the fall is so important. So to kind of pull all this together, when we look at these small grain forages and have some target dates there, after August 1st, I think what we're looking at is what I would call an annual forage system, and not trying to manage these small grains in a row crop system. At least the non-winter hardy small grains, the spring small grains, we've had some very good success producing forage during that time of year. Challenge that we've got is it's again, it's enough to graze and can be kind of borderline on mechanical harvest. Given the right conditions, and they're probably 1 year out of 10, it's probably enough production, warm enough temperatures and dry enough that you can harvest some hay. So it's kind of an opportunity as opposed to a management strategy. Harvesting silage, there are a number of, I know, Gary, some of the guys you've worked with down in the southeastern part of the state have harvested some silage or haylage from rye in the latter part of the fall. But again, the conditions have to be right. So it can be done, and so that's why I say I think it works better in an annual forage system. One of the things that we see sometimes are non-winter hardy or spring small grains mixed with winter hardy species to provide some fall grazing. And then also those winter hardy species will survive the winter and then be productive into the spring. I've seen that work, but we have not collected any data on it, so I don't know the extent of what we might expect. When we look at September 1st or later, this is kind of the time of year that you can go a couple of different ways. You can think that annual forage system or some of the earlier maturing row crop that I showed a little bit ago. So what we're looking at there is either a winter hardy or a non-winter hardy species. And again, these two can be mixed for fall grazing and then also spring forage production. After October 1st, when we're looking again at an annual forage system or some of the late maturing row crops, the thing we've got to think about here is that we can only expect much production out of these winter hardy small grains, and then the majority of our production then is going to occur during the spring. Okay, so we do have a lot of options, but we've also got a lot of decisions to make and many things to think about. That's why these are so hard, the love-hate relationship with the small grains. And so I promised you we would come back again and look at these small grain forage costs. Okay? Talk about this just a little bit. What I showed on that first slide was basically this total cost. Okay. And so what I've tried to do here is separate this out into a fall production only, a spring production only, and then I've combined that into a fall plus a spring production. And so the fall plus spring production, that would be that instance probably where you're blending seed together that are spring species and winter hardy species, where you're grazing some in the fall and then harvesting it possibly as silage then in the spring. Okay. When we look at that fall only, typically what we're talking here would be late summer planted oat would be an example of that, possibly mixed with some brassica, although I've just focused primarily on the small grain. But basically what we're looking at here, seed costs, and my example was 70 pounds of seed per acre at 33 cents per pound. If you dig around, that basically will represent rye, although rye doesn't fit the fall forage production very well. So your seed costs and planting costs here can be upwards of about $50 an acre just to buy the seed and plant it. Okay. There's a small fertilization. I used a rate of 40 pounds of nitrogen in the fall. When I put this together, urea was about $850 a ton. It's probably higher than that now, so I suspect that price may have gone up. What are you guys going to do about high nitrogen prices? Yeah, you going to fertilize or not? That's what I'm asking. I thought about that on the drive up, and I couldn't come up with a very good answer. The only answer I could come up with is that if we're trying to plant some of these small grains after corn grain, there's usually residual nitrogen remaining in a lot of those corn fields. Soybean, we kind of expect, any of you guys in here CCAs? Come on, fess up. I get to help write the test for Nebraska. What do we expect the nitrogen contribution from soybean to be? Gary Lesswing's already left. No, he hadn't. Gary, I'll put you on the spot. What's the nitrogen contribution from soybean? Forage? Yeah.
Right after the forage, it's usually not until it finishes up until the spring.
Yeah, okay, that's the answer, 40 pounds. We expect about 40 pounds of nitrogen from soybean production. Some of the work we've done with small grains following soybean, I question whether there's 40 pounds of nitrogen there. So, the best I can come up with is, you look at that, you pull that nitrogen cost out, you still got forage production occurs. Is it more cost effective to do that than not? I don't know the answer. Okay. So the fall production, if we look at that, that's the most expensive forage production, just about any way we look at it, just because the production is not as high as it can be in the spring. Okay. Typically what we're going to look at is this spring production here. Seed costs, planting costs are still the same. It still costs the same amount to get in the spring forage production game than it does the fall forage production game. Fertilization rate, the recommended rates are a little bit higher. However, because even though the total cost per acre is higher, that increased production makes that forage production cost lower than it does for the fall, even though we've got a higher fertility rate. So when we think about that fertility rate, if we expect those forages may respond to nitrogen, it's probably beneficial to go ahead and apply some nitrogen to that growth. I don't know that we don't want to do it just because it's more expensive than it's ever been. Okay. And then when we combine these two, the fall and spring, typically what we see is a further reduction in the total cost per ton. So effectively, the more production that you can gain, the cheaper that forage is going to be on a cost per ton basis. I was afraid that answer was going to come. I don't know that I know a good answer to that. So the question is on the blending of the spring types and the winter types for fall and spring grazing or fall and spring forage production. What's an appropriate ratio of seed? Did I catch that right, Dan? Okay. That's one of the things you'll see on my summary slide, that while we think that's a good idea, I don't know that we know an answer. I don't know that I use this 70 pound as a rye monoculture. I don't know that we need a full seeding rate of each one of those. I think we can back off of that a little bit, probably 75% of the recommended, the full seeding rate. So 75% of 70. There's too many not zeros in that for me to do. So, probably somewhere around 55, 60 pounds of rye, and then 55 to 60 pounds of some kind of spring variety. So kind of summarize a little bit, at least, of what we know, or at least we think we know. These small grains, even though they're lumped together, they respond to similar management. They do have some variability in production when you compare them at the same point in time. Okay? Some of the data that Mary's going to show you, when you compare them at a similar growth stage, a lot of that variability seems to be reduced. We also, pretty sure we know this, that the small grains can have some very high forage quality. We also know that for most of the small grains, planting date is pretty critical agronomic practice. If we're looking for fall growth, we need to focus on a planting date before October 1st. After October 1st, primarily what we're looking at is spring growth. And then we also need to keep in our mind that even though we're thinking about fall and spring, we still need to keep that planting date effects in the back of our mind. We don't need to delay planting date to the last minute for fall forage production, because that late planting date typically carries over. What we don't know, or what we haven't figured out yet, and Dan, this was that question that was asked on these mixtures. When we think about binary mixtures or mixtures of two different species, simple mixtures are somewhere 4, 5, or 6 different species. And then these complex mixtures, which is getting one of everything on the menu, so to speak. Okay. There's a lot of producers that are using those. Some of them are very happy with that. I don't know that we have a whole lot of data that we can look at and make recommendations. I think a lot of what's going to go on locally, this is kind of where that peer-to-peer learning, or talking to your neighbor across the fence, you can find out more talking across the fence sometime than you can calling me on the telephone or sending me an email asking me what I think, because it's basically that. It's just what I think. I don't really have anything to point to. And then one of the other things that we haven't really figured out yet is how we optimize this spring management. Okay, I call that, or are we going to be a row crop producer, or are we going to be a forage producer? And I think that dictates a lot of how our thinking goes there. Because when we're thinking from a row crop mentality, we're giving up oftentimes quite a bit of production on some of these small grains. And when you saw those costs of production, most of those are pretty set in stone. That seed cost and planting cost there is not going to be reduced. You can reduce the nitrogen a little bit, but it's not really going to that might be a consideration based on the yield. So I think there's some things you can play with on the economics and kind of streamline some of the forage economics there. So the take-home messages, and I'm about finished up. The small grain forages, as we've talked about, they're all very similar. They all have similar management, but here's the important point: they can be very different. And it's important for us to understand the differences so that we can begin to optimize a lot of that spring forage management. And I touched on this a little bit. Oftentimes, what works in one region may not work in another region. Typically, that's going to be temperature, precipitation. And then finally, one of the things I always like to ask, it's when we think about optimizing small grain forage yield, particularly in the spring, it's important to think of beyond cost per acre. I showed you those cost per acres on my second slide. How many of you guys were ready to quit after a production cost per acre that might be $150 per acre? You'd have a hard time convincing someone to do that. So that's why I think it's important that we think beyond cost per acre and think a little bit about how we can optimize the small grain forage yield. And with that, I'll quit. I've got 2 minutes for questions, 3 minutes for questions. So the question is that related to the accumulated growing degree day graph that I showed? As you move up further north than where we are here in the eastern part of Nebraska, what does that change on that graph? I think what you see is it's not as high. I think you see a similar pattern, but what you see is it shift down. The total is not as great. So I think what you have to do there is back that up further in the earlier in the year is how that would be compensated for. So his question was, I got called on the carpet for bringing up the fertilizer, not fertilized. So he's holding my feet to the fire and making me answer that question, which I appreciate. So, that's a good question. I think some of that, in an annual forage system where we can control the timing of what we plant much better. I think oftentimes what we see is probably about a ton and a half of production for 40 to 50 pounds. I don't know that we'll ever see, and a lot of the data, let me qualify, a lot of the data I showed was in small plots that can be very intensively managed. When we move what we see in the small plots out on a field scale, typically we see a reduction of about 25 to 30% anyway. Okay. So keeping that in mind, I think we can probably, without fertilization, just to answer you, without fertilization, I think we can expect about a ton of production. Okay. I don't know what the crude protein is going to be on that. I will suspect it'll be, probably before you get to that ton of production, it might be 7 to 8%. 40 to 50 pounds of nitrogen fertilization, likely to add another ton to that with a little higher quality. I don't know that we want to think about putting 150 pounds of nitrogen on any of these small grains. So just a general rule of thumb, I think we'd be looking at something on the order about 40 to 50 pounds for the fall. If you were planting early enough that you knew you were going to use it. If you didn't think you were going to use it, I would wait till the spring and put 60. So I would go with that middle part of that cost table. And that cost table is in your guys' proceedings. The difference in the yield on grazing. No. Yeah, well, I think on nitrogen for grazing, I don't know that you don't need quite as much because you're grazing it before it meets its full production capacity. And then at least from my standpoint, grazing wastes so much forage, that you're probably better off not to fertilize the waste unless you've got a way figured out to recoup that nitrogen recycling. Yeah, so the other question is kind of a follow-up question to the high prices of nitrogen fertilization. In the great state of Nebraska, we have so many cattle, you know, there's we have access to quite a bit of cattle manure. There is possibility to use for that. You know, it's been quite a bit of work on that in a lot of our row crop production, but not so much on the forage side. But you know, that is an opportunity. I do think the amount required for the forage production is going to be quite a bit less than would be necessary for row crop production.
Thank you, Daren.